The UK housing market is in big trouble. House prices have been officially falling for over 4 months. And in my opinion, things are only going to get worse. And what I'm seeing in the data at the moment is a lot worse than I ever imagined last year. So at the end of August last year, when I sold my house and moved into a rental property, I thought things were going to get bad from an economic perspective, but I didn't think they were going to get this bad and this sustained. So if this follows through into house prices, things are going to get very messy. So in this video, I've got a number of things that I want to run through with you guys to just remind you really, because I know many of you guys have been watching my videos for a while, of all the things that are stacking up, that are weighing against the housing market at the moment, and how some of these things are a lot worse than I was expecting when we've been talking about them over the past few months. So the first thing I want to take a look at, and that is inflation, which is of no surprise to anyone that's been following the economic data. Inflation is still a big problem, and in some ways actually getting worse. So let me just read you a few paragraphs covering the most recent inflation figures. Consumer prices rose 8.7% last month compared with a year ago, down from 10.1% in March, the Office for National Statistics said on Wednesday. Economists had forecast an annual rate of 8.2%, according to a Reuters poll. So that's a 0.5% difference between what actually happened versus market expectations. Food prices increased 19.1% in April, slightly down from 19.2% in March, which was a 45-year high. So food inflation is just insanely high and it is out of control. But this is the real thing that has spooked the markets, and this is why over the past couple of weeks we've seen lots of stories about how we're now expecting the Bank of England base rates to go much higher than we were expecting only a few weeks ago. And this is core inflation. Core inflation, which strips out volatile food and energy costs, came in at 6.8%, the highest rate since 1992 and up from 6.2% in March. So although overall inflation is coming down, because that includes food and energy, which have just been runaway out of control, core inflation, which strips out those more volatile factors, is actually up. So that is what has spooked the government. That is what has spooked the markets. So inflation is still a big problem. And if you go back 6 months ago, people were saying that inflation was going to be well under control by now. Things are going to be coming down sharply. But the truth is this month should have been a huge drop, as it's when the energy cost increased from the Ukraine war from last year kicked in. So we should have seen a massive drop, and we have not seen that. So this has spooked the markets and it's spooked the government. It's also spooked the Bank of England. So interest rates are currently at 4.5%. Now, just imagine all of the stuff with the mini budget hadn't happened, and just think back a year ago. Could you really imagine that the Bank of England was ever going to get to 4.5%? Now, for those of you like me who watch the markets and understand things, you would have hoped that was going to be the case to fight inflation. But in reality, none of us really felt the Bank of England were actually going to do it. But the truth is we're now at 4.5% and looking to go higher, quite easily to 5%, maybe 5.5%. So interest rates are still going up. Whereas the people that are saying this was just going to be a blip, we're expecting interest rates to have topped by now, and we're going to be coming down by the end of the year. And at the moment, I just cannot see any way that interest rates are going to be coming down later this year. They're going to keep going up for the next few months, and then they're probably going to stay that way for a long time until this inflation is fully under control. And this has had a big impact on the housing market in a number of ways. So first one, the obvious one, the cost of mortgages has gone up. So look at this. This is a chart of mortgage interest rates. So the Bank of England rates and the mortgage rates don't always move exactly in alignment, but they generally go in the same direction. So we can see here, new advances, so this is people taking out new mortgages, are facing much higher interest rates on an average of around about 4.5%. Whereas the people with the blue line here, the outstanding balances, these are people that are still yet to remortgage. So remember, there are over 100,000 households every single month that have yet to remortgage away from much lower rates to a rate which is probably going to be at least double what they have been used to paying. So we're seeing some of the pain already. There's a lot of pain to come. And remember, the Bank of England is not done with hiking interest rates. So things are only going to get worse when it comes to mortgage affordability. And if we go to the next tab, we can see this reflected in the data. So this is mortgage approvals, which shows demand is massively down. Look at this red line here. Down to, 48,000 is the official figure for new number of approvals for house purchases. If you compare that to at the peaks, we're looking at nearly 100,000, and we are well below the historic average of around about, I'd say it's around about 70,000. So mortgage demand is massively down. So if demand is down, that's going to have an impact on prices as there's less people competing for the same property. And again, this is clearly shown in the figures here. This is the latest from UK Property Line. So if you're not following them on Twitter, check them out. This is, let me just hide the webcam for a second. You can see this is the number of listings on Rightmove. So we've gone from just over 200,000 at the start of 2022, and we're over 400,000 at the moment. So between this tab showing the number of available properties increasing massively and the previous tab showing that mortgage approvals are down massively, the supply and demand argument has been completely blown out of the water. And this has been reflected in actual house prices. So this maps both nationwide house prices, which are the prices that are agreed at the point of sale. So it's not when the actually goes through officially. This is at the mortgage approval stage once the valuation has been done. And also the ONS, which are the official figures, but they lag nationwide because they are the completed prices. So we can see nationwide, out of 8 months, they've been down 7 out of 8 months, only stopping for a temporary blip here, which is probably going to be the spring bounce, which gives you an idea of how bad things are. And the ONS are quickly following. So nationwide are now reporting annual falls, and it won't be many more months until the land registry are reporting the same thing. But it's very, very clear both nationwide and ONS are showing that house prices are down steeply month on month, and nationwide showing them falling annually as well, with the ONS not far behind. So those are the key figures around mortgage approvals, interest rates and house prices. But there are a number of other issues which go alongside this. We've got GDP is basically sideways and has only just got back to pre-COVID levels. So with all this money printing, over 700 billion and massive inflation, GDP is still barely at, well, you'd say break even really, but really over the past 2 months, we're in negative growth. So people saying we're not officially in recession, what's the point of not being in recession when growth is effectively non-existent and people are getting poorer because inflation is outstripping wage growth? We're also seeing employment start to tick up, and this would be a lot worse if they didn't keep manipulating the figures to move people out of unemployment into economically inactive, which we've covered in previous videos. But unemployment is starting to increase. We're seeing savings rates shoot back up, and these savings rates we're seeing now on a 1-year fixed to over 5%. This is above what we saw during the mini budget. So from the market perspective, if they are offering high interest rates now, they see things are worse, or they're expecting interest rates to remain higher for longer if they're offering higher interest rates now than they were during the peak of the mini budget. We're also seeing some massive bank failures in America, and that has had a small impact in the UK as well. But these are the 3 big banks that have failed in 2023. And you can look how many banks failed in 2008 and 2009, and these are relative in size. So massive banks have failed, and a lot more banks, many more banks would have failed if central banks such as the Fed hadn't basically opened up an unlimited, they're saying they're not printing money, but they are effectively printing money because they're offering to buy back all of the bonds at the rate that they were bought for. So the banks have received a bailout, and that is why we had a temporary drop in interest rates, which I'm going to come back to later in this video. So I'm going to wrap up with a summary of what's happened over the past 9 months. We've also seen a change in narrative from the mainstream media. Only last week we saw this on the BBC and as front page news on a number of newspapers. House prices fall at the fastest pace in nearly 14 years. So the mainstream media narrative is starting to come around and look very, very crashy. The swaps and the gilts, they're looking awful as well. And I've been talking about this same graph again and again and again. We are still holding this trend line. And I'm going to zoom in on this section in a moment just to talk you through what has happened since really everyone started talking about house prices from kind of the mini budget onwards. But this has been holding since the Bank of England started hiking interest rates. Swaps have been going up consistently, and everyone thought that the mini budget was the top. But in reality, this was just a canary in the coal mine. We've been holding this trend line, and swap rates, this is for a 5-year swap, are just under 5% at the moment. And this is the rate at which banks or institutions lend to other institutions. So the more it costs them to lend to each other, the higher that mortgage rates are going to be. And this is shown in today's news that we can see that mortgage rates are rising again. So after the mini budget, they started to come down, and now the market is starting to wake up to the reality that this was just a warning sign. It was not necessarily the top. And if we go back to the gilts and we zoom in, and we can basically run through the story of what happened here. The Bank of England started hiking interest rates in response to raging inflation. We then had the mini budget, which really spooked the market. Things started to come back down. And then we saw lots of articles about people saying this is just a blip and everything's going to be fine. And we saw a slight pickup in the housing market, kind of a rebound almost. But that was very, very short-lived. We then had the banking crisis, which is why we had this peak where things were heading back up. The banking crisis happened, and then everyone thought that the central banks were going to have to start printing more money and maybe even lower interest rates. So rates started to come back down. But then reality hit home that inflation is here to stay. And that is why we are back up at these levels, and we're still holding this upward trend line. And at the moment, there's no reason why these interest rates are going to come down all the time that we have an inflation problem that is made worse by the fact that other countries around the world are actually starting to make some progress with their inflation. So the UK is really starting to stand out as a bad investment if the UK government or the Bank of England don't offer high interest rates. People aren't going to want to invest in the UK or buy the UK's debt. So when you add all of those factors together, that is a massive weight on the UK housing market. I do believe it's in big, big trouble. And I believe prices at the moment, with what I'm seeing, with the amount of reductions I'm seeing on Rightmove, I believe prices are currently in free fall, and that's going to be reflected in the data later on in the year because the data lags a lot. Always remember that. What I'm going to do now is pop a link to my Twitter in the top comment, so check me out on there if you aren't already. I'm also going to pop up a video that talks you through some of the red flags to be aware of on Rightmove. So whether you're buying or selling a house, be aware of these Rightmove red flags, and I'll see you guys over there.